Good morning, history classes. It is Monday, May 4th. May the 4th be with you. Sorry, I'm picking dog hairs off the brim of my cap. Okay, this week we're going to be talking about the women's movement, particularly that which took place from the 50s through the 70s, because this is a history class and this is the standard that I'm supposed to be teaching you. However, what I want you to remember is that nothing ever comes from nothing. Nothing ever exists in a vacuum. The women's movement, or the feminism that took place, the activism that took place from the 1950s to the 1970s, didn't come from nothing, and it didn't lead to nothing. What this era that we're talking about of the women's liberation movement is called now is second wave feminism. Second wave feminism implies, of course, a first wave feminism. We've already actually talked about first wave feminism. We just didn't describe it as such. First wave feminism, what people mean by that, is the fight for women's suffrage in the late 1800s and first couple of decades of the 1900s. The right of women to vote and things like that. Following that fight, though, and once white women were given the right to vote in the United States, then there followed the Great Depression and World War II. And when huge national calamities like these things happen, especially when two of them happen back to back, things like social progress movements like the women's liberation movement or feminism tend to get pushed to the back burner for a while. So for the period of the Great Depression and World War II, first of all, with the Great Depression, women who had had jobs during World War I, when the American soldiers came home, the women generally went back home to take care of their families. Women and men returned to the jobs that they'd had before they were inducted into the military for the war. Then the Great Depression happened, so it was just a matter of survival, trying to keep your family together and everyone alive. Then when World War II came about, of course, again, the men went off to war. A lot of women took their places in factories. In fact, my grandmother, my mom's mom, had a wartime job during the Second World War. She worked in an airplane factory in Tulsa. But still, the point wasn't so much about feminism. It was more about national survival. The men were at war, so the women took over in the factories. Following World War II, then, with the arrival of peacetime and economic prosperity in the 1950s, you get a resurgence of the women's movement, of women's lib, as it was called for a while when I was a kid. So starting in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, you get a much greater push for women, and this has a lot more to do with kind of de facto discrimination against women, not so much laws like with first wave feminism, laws that kept women from being able to vote. With second wave feminism in the 50s through the 70s, you had a much greater push against attitudes, against women being paid less than men in the workplace, which they still are, for equal work, and things of this nature. This also coincided with the sexual revolution in the 1960s, women demanding the right to control their bodies, control their sexual morality and things like that, which also gave us the rise of Roe versus Wade in 1973, I believe, which legalized abortion in the United States and which is still the law of the land. Following the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment, I say defeat, but I'll get back to that in a minute, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, then for the decade of the 1980s, feminism was kind of dead on arrival. Not a whole lot of people identified as feminists in the 1980s when I was in high school. But then with the beginning of the 90s, you had two things that rose up. First of all was the confirmation of the Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who is still on the Supreme Court. This was in 1991. And he was confirmed by the Senate to the Supreme Court, even though he had been very credibly accused of sexual harassment by a woman named Anita Hill, who had worked for him for a while. And this confirmation process and kind of the humiliation of Anita Hill, the confirmation of this man as a Supreme Court justice, even though he had been very credibly accused of sexual harassment, combined with a new movement kind of in the, I'd say this came up around Seattle, kind of around the time grunge happened, if you've ever listened to Nirvana or anything like that. Kind of a parallel cultural development with that was what was called the Riot Grrrls, RIOTGRRRLS. And the Riot Grrrls were kind of a post-punk feminist musical movement, if you will. And that, plus the Anita Hill controversy, gave rise to third wave feminism, which was what, when I was a young man, that was very much current at the time. This is through the 1990s, early 2000s. And again, this was very much about young women taking ownership, taking...
Origins of the current outbreak. What other paper do you know that's questioned?
Didn't mean to hit that. Taking agency over their own bodies again. And then fourth wave feminism began in the 2010s, so this has just been in the last 10 years. And with fourth wave feminism, you have what's called intersectionality. And intersectionality just means, and this kind of goes back to first wave feminism, where we point out that the amendment that gave women the right to vote really only affected white women, because women of color of all kinds were still prohibited from voting because of their race. Intersectionalism simply means where feminism meets or intersects with other fights for civil rights. So feminism for white women is going to look different than feminism for African American women, or feminism for Latina women, or feminism for Native American women. And that kind of meeting place and what happens there when you realize, okay, the women getting the right to the vote in the early 20th century was not a great achievement for women of color. Things like that, we need to also look at not just white women, but make sure that the concerns of women of color are not overlooked in the overall fight for women's rights. So that's kind of the story of fourth wave feminism, which is pretty much where we are now. But, so that's the context. Going back to the 50s through the 70s, second wave feminism, and what gets called the women's rights movement. All right. After World War II, most women gave up their jobs to returning servicemen and went back home to take care of their families. Social analysts and popular culture portrayed women, especially suburban housewives, as the personification of America's achievement of the good life. By the end of the 1960s, however, a broad-based movement to attain sexual equality had arisen. The women's movement fundamentally changed American life from family and education to careers and political issues. Historians often refer to the women's movement of the 1960s and 1970s as the second wave of feminism, or the theory of political, social, and economic equality of men and women. The struggle for women's rights has had a long history, going back at least to the 1840s when women drafted the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls, New York. The phrase second wave of feminism also reminds us that the first wave, which culminated with women winning the right to vote in 1920, again, white women winning the right to vote in 1920, ended well before the nation addressed the call for full equality. In the decades that followed, women made little legal or social headway in the battle for equal rights. Several factors influenced the rebirth of the women's movement in the 1960s and 1970s. The civil rights struggle prompted women to look at the ways in which society judged and discriminated against them as a group. As Casey Hayden and Mary King, two veterans of that movement, put it, sex and caste. There seem to be many parallels that can be drawn between the treatment of Negroes and the treatment of women in society as a whole. Okay, this is a direct quote. It's the reason I'm using the phrase Negroes. This was still in current use back during this time in the 1960s. And by caste, they mean kind of social standing. So the term and idea of caste comes from India, where you have a very strict caste system from the very top kind of ruling caste down to the very lowest, who are called and considered the untouchables. And this kind of stratification of social acceptability has always been very present in America as anywhere else in the world. So they're looking at, again, this is kind of an intersectional idea, the intersection of both sex or gender and social standing. So for a rich white woman, again, it's going to look very different than it would look for a poor woman of color. Okay. All right, let's see. Where was I? Civil rights movement both inspired women to demand gender equality and taught them ways to get it. It also brought black and white women together, strengthening their shared cause. Again, intersectionalism. Women also wanted to redefine how they were viewed. Many women objected to the inaccuracy of the housewife stereotype. Some needed to work to support themselves or their families. Others wanted more opportunities than their lives as housewives could offer. As Betty Friedan powerfully articulated this message in her groundbreaking book, The Feminine Mystique, and I quote, "The problem lay buried unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone. As she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night, she was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all?" Okay. So we're kind of talking about a woman's desire and right to personal fulfillment, if you will, and existence as more than a suburban housewife. The suburbs themselves had only been invented really after World War II, beginning in the late 1940s. And so now all of a sudden, whereas previous generations of women had been either living and working on a farm, probably in a multi-generational household, or living in a city center where they were surrounded by friends and probably family too. Now with the suburbs, you have whole families moving out away from the city, but not onto a farm. And there's a very strong sense of isolation where, okay, you're out in the suburbs, you have your home, but there's really not, if you're a woman, and particularly in the 1950s, there's not a whole lot that you do outside of the home unless it's ferrying your children back and forth to their activities or going to the grocery store. And in the 1950s and 60s, women largely decide, hey, you know what, this isn't all that life should be. I'm fine doing this, but I want more. Okay. Despite the stereotypes, the number of women in the workforce grew throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Yet, working women often found themselves in dead-end jobs. Even those with training and education had their access to careers or advancement blocked, in many cases, by blatantly discriminatory employers. Sandra Day O'Connor, who ultimately became the first female Supreme Court justice, and she became a member of the Supreme Court during my lifetime. I was a kid when Sandra Day O'Connor became a Supreme Court justice. Graduated near the top of her class at Stanford Law School in the early 1950s. Yet, while she found few employment opportunities upon graduation, her male counterparts won job offers at prestigious law firms. Facing such restrictions, women increasingly demanded equal treatment in the workplace. Another thing, a way that this, what's the word I'm trying to think? Discriminatory employers. One way that this discrimination really took form was in the idea that women could get pregnant at any time, particularly if they were married, and a lot of women were at this time. If you were a young professional woman who was married, but you were trying to gain access to promotions, higher paying jobs within your field, whatever that field might be, a lot of times it was used against you. Well, you could get pregnant, and then if you get pregnant, you're going to be gone for a while. So we're not going to take the risk of giving you this promotion that you're just going to leave behind in a year or two when you get pregnant, go home and have kids. So we're not going to give you this promotion. We're going to give it to a man who's not going to be having to go out on maternity leave. So this is one of the big manifestations of this kind of really anti-woman bigotry. Okay, several years after she wrote The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan helped establish the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which is still around. The organization, which dedicated itself to winning true equality for all women and to attaining a full and equal partnership of the sexes, galvanized the women's movement. NOW set out to break down barriers of discrimination in the workplace and in education. It attacked stereotypes of women in the media and called for more balance in roles and marriages. It had two major priorities. The first was to bring about the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, an amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee gender equality under the law. The ERA initially had been proposed in the early 1920s, but had never passed. The second was to protect reproductive rights, especially the right to an abortion. NOW worked within the existing political system, lobbying for political reforms and readying court cases to compel the government to enforce existing legislation that banned discrimination. For some women, NOW seemed too extreme. For others, it was not extreme enough. Still, NOW served as a rallying point to promote equality for all women. Okay, so we're going to get through the rest of this chapter tomorrow, and then you'll have a video to watch later in the week, okay, or a documentary. Anyway, hope everyone's well. Stay dry during the storms we're supposed to have this afternoon, and take care. I'll talk to you tomorrow.